KnockBack, the retro and nostalgia podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to KnockBack. My name is Colin Moriarty. I'm joined as always by my brother, Dagan Moriarty. Dagan, it's good to see you, my friend. How are you today?
You mean, Dagan, I'm cooler than your dad, Moriarty?
What does that mean?
I need a moniker. I don't know. I just need a thing. And I'm seeing a lot of Dagan's a dad energy lately in the YouTube feedback specifically, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm an aging dad. What do you want me to do? I talk about these things, but I'm still, And, but let me ask you a question, because I'm workshopping it. Okay. Workshopping the moniker, the nickname. Do you think being cooler than your dad, maybe that sends the wrong message? Like, that's actually the opposite. That's maybe not so cool. No offense to your dad, but
it doesn't take much to be cooler than our dad, I guess is what you're saying. So it's kind of like a passive compliment.
Yeah, or passive aggressive one. I'm not sure. Right. And I think, everything post Fonz, everything post Arthur Fonzarelli, I think calling yourself cool automatically means you're not cool.
Are you talking about Fonz in the historical sense, like in the 50s, or Fonz in the TV show of the 70s and 80s?
No, that's a good question. I'm talking about Fonz as a pop culture icon.
Got it. So
he knew he was cool. He said as much, and he was really cool. Everything after that, as soon as you're saying you're cool, right, you're losing that sort of nuanced hipster flavor of you're supposed to just know I'm cool without me saying it. But like everything, I'm maybe overthinking it a bit.
Well, can I just be honest with you about something about Happy Days? Please. It wasn't until I was a teenager that I realized it wasn't a show from the 50s. I don't know why I didn't ever make the connection that it was. And it was a commercial that Nick and Knight used to put on where it was like a show. It was like a show about the 50s the commercial was like a show about the 50s that started in the 70s and ended in the 80s or something. And I was like, wait, what?
It gets a little meta. You know what? I'll admit something if we're fessing up right now.
Yeah.
And this is really bad. But, let me just be honest. I thought the Brady Bunch, when I was really little, I thought that was supposed to be set in the 50s, but it was new. But how did I not realize it was the 70s, since that show looked like everything it was around me?
Right. It was 68 to 75 or something, right? Something like that, the dates. It started in the 60s.
I don't know if I realized that.
Let me see that. I'm going to throw out here. This is Colin Moriarty TV Energy. Let's see if it's right. 68 to 75. All right. Let's see. Brady Bunch Wiki. 69 to 74.
Oh, you were like so close. Oh my god. Still, I think you definitely get the
5 seasons, dude. That was all it was. There was only
5 seasons.
There's like 120 episodes. It's really not.
That's
117. That's not a lot. Plus the movies. And they came, not the 90s movies, but they did movies like
The Trip to Hawaii. Does that count as a movie? That was a movie, right?
That was a movie, wasn't it? What am I crazy, or did they not do movies? Maybe they didn't. I thought they did.
Made for TV movies.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah. Not films, but like, the Hawaii. And I think that might have been split into multiple episodes or whatever.
Right, multi-parters rather than a feature length.
Shout out to Mike Lookinland as Bobby Brady. What a name. What an iconic beginning of a show that is. That will become a meta, like it might already be, the Dr. Wily screen kind of.
Yeah.
That will probably in our lifetimes become a like, what are you referencing thing, which is kind of scary to think about.
That was the first split screen thing.
You have to assume that Keiji Inafune stole that or something from. And instead of Alice, it's Dr. Wily. It's a little bit different.
It's a reach, but yeah, that could happen.
All right. Oh, by the way, you said you complimented me when you got into the room today on my shirt, which I appreciate. It's rare for me to wear a shirt with nothing on it, which is strange. However, there's a method to the madness with these shirts.
Wait a second.
The person who makes my custom t-shirts sent me a bunch of blank t-shirts of different brands and sizes so I can start trying them on and figuring out which ones I like to get a new run of shirts done. Because I'm getting, I don't know if it's my gut. It might be a little bit of my gut, but I'm also getting more muscular. And I'm not really just fitting in the medium shirts anymore. I need to start wearing large shirts. So I got to do a whole test here to see what's going to wash right, what's going to dry right, what feels good, what size and brand. And then from there, I'm going to get a bunch of new shirts made. So this is one of the shirts that I'm testing out today.
It looks comfy. Now, Kyle, if we're going to go to the gun show, why not stick with the medium?
Because I look like I'm pregnant in those shirts. Yeah.
But for the podcast, it works because you're cut off there.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I'm not trying to, my guns aren't getting too crazy at all, but they're kind of flatlining a little bit because I only use 40-pound weights or 20-pound weights to lift. I can't take much more than that. It makes me tired because I want to get on the elliptical afterwards.
I understand.
I can't be gassing myself on becoming a meathead. All right, my friend, let's get into the topic at hand today.
All right, I'm ready.
Final Fantasy II. The real Final Fantasy II. This is an interesting one because this was a lost and mysterious game to Western audiences for a long period of time, although the next Final Fantasy we'll do in the coming weeks or months is Final Fantasy III, the real Final Fantasy III. And that was the last Final Fantasy game that we ever got in the West access to. And it wasn't until 2006, I want to say, that we got a localized version of that game. However, Final Fantasy II came to Famicom in late 1988, and it was an interesting game that was actually primarily made in the United States, which I don't think a lot of people know, and was supposed to be localized. And actually there are localized kind of rough versions of it available. I think it was at CES in 1990 to be shown off. But the reality is that Final Fantasy II kind of fell off. And because Final Fantasy IV was on the horizon by that point, when they were localizing it, they were like, we'll call that Final Fantasy II and we'll bring that to the West. And that's where all the confusion comes from. They skip Final Fantasy V as well and bring Final Fantasy VI over as Final Fantasy III. And it's very strange. I don't know why they thought they should skip any of these games, because they were selling appreciably in the West, but nonetheless, they decided to do that. But what's interesting for us is that it's not until the spring of 2003. And I remember this very well when Final Fantasy Origins came to PlayStation 1. It was one of the last PS1 releases ever. And it was a Final Fantasy 1 and Final Fantasy 2. And this was the first time in the West we would get Final Fantasy 2. And that was the last PS1 game I bought in the spring of 2003. And then finally we got more standalone versions. I didn't play the GBA version, but it was in 2004. And then it came to PSP in 2007. That's the last time I played it. And finally in the Pixel Remaster version, so kind of a more traditional version, we got it on Switch and PS4 in 2023. And that's what we're playing off of here. It's an interesting and exciting game to talk about. It's definitely an evolution. And what I realized about Final Fantasy II, and maybe I appreciated this more as I'm studying it more deeply as I played it now and taking notes, is there's a lot of origins here. A lot of things start here that maybe we would have given credit to other games later on. And we'll get into that. I mean, Sid and Chocobos and all sorts of things really begin here. Mysidia as a place. There's a lot. Dragoons, so on and so forth. So we'll get into all of that. But I'm curious what your experience with Final Fantasy II was, Dig. Did you enjoy it? How did you like it coming off of Final Fantasy I? For those that are unaware, we did Final Fantasy I. We're going to do all 6 Final Fantasy games in the Pixel Remaster over the next, I hope, by the end of the calendar year. I would assume we can probably get through them. And so, yeah, much to discuss. I'm really curious to hear what you think of this game.
Yeah, I was excited to do this one. And it's interesting. First of all, thank you for joining us on the march towards the Final Fantasy games that matter. That's so we're getting there. That's so cynical, though. It's nice to go back and just explore the history, because I like Final Fantasy I, which we covered already. I had no experience with this game. So it was fun to go in. I was really curious because really the only 2 things I knew about this game going in is that it's largely considered the pariah of the franchise. Everybody hates it, which of course I'm ready to jump in and say, and look, like, I can't wait to investigate how bad can this game really be. And the second thing was what you already mentioned, that it took so long for anybody to get it outside of Japan. If we're saying spring 03, as you just mentioned, Kyle, we're saying 15 years it took for people to experience this game outside of its home of Japan, which is so interesting. And you know what? I had a good time with it. Is it a fun game? We'll get there. But there really is a lot to say. And I like exploring it from the terms of, this is, like you already kind of mentioned, this is kind of the skeleton that they continued to build the franchise around. This is kind of ground zero, the flashpoint for a lot of things to come and a lot of the greatness to come. But it's nice to see the semblance of the bedrock that they're continuing to build on here. And I think there's a nice trade-off in this game and experiencing it. It was a unique experience. It's obviously very different than a lot of the other offerings that we would get later. But I think there are positives and negatives. And I think it's going to be fun to go in and break down and talk about them. And of course, I played the Pixel Remasters. I've been playing on Switch. Just bought the collection. Well worth it, I think. I think Definitely. They did a great job with these Pixel Remasters. And just for some context, I'm not sure if I mentioned this in episode 1, Kyle. It's probably important to know as we continue to dissect the Final Fantasy games from the beginning. I've only ever gotten through Final Fantasy VIII. I've never got beyond that. And now I'm filling in my gaps from 1 to 6. So just for the audience, for some context of what I have experienced insofar as Final Fantasy, but also knowing that Final Fantasy IV, one of my favorite games of all time, and Final Fantasy VI, of course, we're going to get there and celebrate the hell out of that game. But it's nice to go back and look back and see what came first and kind of the fits and starts. And I feel like this game was still in that experimental stage. And you know what the other thing that occurred to me while I was playing this, Kyle? Dragon Quest really needed, and also ran, like Dragon Quest really needed some competition. It really makes sense to me that the Final Fantasy franchise was already successful at this point because people wanted more of that and they wanted something a little different. And I think this franchise offers that, even going back to the late 80s. You know what else made me laugh? There's so much criticism around this game, but it's so ambitious. And I think back to 1988, we were playing Gyromite and Urban Champion at this point. Mm-hmm. And this game is so much bigger. It thinks so much bigger than some of those early Nintendo games that we were still, getting our feet wet with in North America. So say what you want about this game, but I give it such a tip of the cap just for pure ambition.
And how small the team was that were making these games, I think is impressive too. They made and released this game in a year from the launch of the first one.
That's incredible.
I've said before that I think Final Fantasy IV was made in something like 14 months. It just doesn't seem possible. I have no idea how you do that. And as I was playing through Final Fantasy II, I was really trying to think about the design of the game, how they built it. And you can kind of see what they probably did, which was you build out these worlds and then you justify your travels through the world. And things don't they kind of happen like that today, especially with side quests in games, but they don't typically work that way anymore. So everything was kind of happening at the same time, because I don't think they even intended on necessarily doing a sequel. But I was bringing up the dates here because this is interesting. Okay. So in Japan on Famicom, Dragon Quest came out in 86 and Final Fantasy in 87. And then Dragon Quest II came out in 87 and Dragon Quest III came out in 88. Final Fantasy II comes out in 88. And then Dragon Quest IV, seminal game, comes out in 1990 and Final Fantasy III comes out in 1990. And by this point, there's a little bit of, and just thinking about their respective games, they're definitely beginning to go in separate directions. Dragon Quest remaining much more staid and true, and Final Fantasy experimenting with new things as they go. I think the only thing that I remember Dragon Quest really changing up from, say, the first and second game, well, first to second game would be multiple party members, but just the depth of the world, the largeness of the enemy roster and all that. But Final Fantasy, you have to give it kind of credit, and you have to give Squaresoft credit for being willing to experiment. The easiest thing they could have done with Final Fantasy II, and I think I appreciated this more in this most recent replay, is the easiest thing they really could have done is to have just replicated the class system, and that would have made a lot of sense of how they would have gotten it done in a year, maybe make new classes and all of that. But they actually opted to make individual characters, which I appreciate, and try to tell a more party-based story that Dragon Quest was kind of experimenting with. But I would argue as a big Dragon Quest fan with experience with every one of those games, except for 10. I never played 10 because it's an MMO in Japan, so obviously we have no access to it. But those games are much more gameplay and statistics driven and about kind of the love of the grind. Final Fantasy tries to differentiate itself from the second game, and definitely in the third and by the fourth game, as being something wildly different. And I think that I wasn't crazy about Final Fantasy 2 when I was younger. It has a very suspect Final Fantasy 8 style, suspect upgrade system and all of this, but I came to kind of appreciate it a little bit more for what it is. It's not what I'm looking for necessarily. I wouldn't recommend this as one of the Final Fantasy games you should play above all others, but I think I like it more than I thought I did. And I think that that's what I kind of walked away from it. How long did it take you to beat? I beat it. I use a strategy guide, like a spoiler-free walkthrough on PSN profiles that just says like, you need to go here, you need to go here, you need to go here. Because I'm not fucking running around doing all that shit. And I love playing with walkthroughs. I've always loved playing with walkthroughs. But I managed to platinum the game straight up 100% of the trophies and beat the game, obviously, in 15 hours flat. But it doesn't feel that extraordinarily fast. I think that I might have saved only a few hours by using a walkthrough, probably. I find that the game's mechanics are broken enough that you can't really be underleveled very appreciably. So, which is both a positive and a negative. But how long did you spend with this game compared to the first one?
Yeah, I spent about 25 hours. That's why we were laughing the other day when you said you platinumed in 15, because at that point I was like, I'm already over that. And I think I'm maybe 2/3 of the way through the game at that point. But I think taking a little longer, you know how I am, especially with JRPGs. I don't use anything. I won't watch YouTube videos. I won't read walkthroughs. I won't use guides. I've always been the same. If I'm going to undertake this time, this journey and this investment in time, I'm just going to do it the old fashioned way. But I think it worked in my favor, because what happens naturally when you're playing a JRPG, if you're adopting that philosophy and playing that way, is that you just grind more than you really have to. So you're always ready, and probably more than ready, for the next adventure in terms of HP and inventory and armor and weapons and all that kind of thing. So I think it kind of helped me avoid maybe some additional frustration with this game, that I was always ready for the next encounter. But of course, one of the problems is the random encounters are notoriously, you're going to hit random encounters every 3 seconds, and that could be frustrating. But I enjoyed playing it that way. And sometimes if I get in a pinch, I'll consult a guide or a walkthrough or just hit a YouTube video really quick. I didn't have to do that with this game. I felt like the world was adequate, but I didn't feel like it was massive. It's a relatively small world, a lot of rehashing and going back over areas and all of that sort of thing. Backtracking.
It really is. There's a lot of backtracking in this game, which I think was like you go to that city, what is that place, Finn or something? You go to it over and over and over again. And I don't really mind it, because there's something interesting about that, where that's the rebel capital in some sense, I guess.
Right.
So you're kind of going back and reporting or whatever. But the disconnect with me, if there is a disconnect with me in this game, it's that it certainly doesn't have Final Fantasy IV's panache for storytelling, where you understand what's really going on and you understand the characters. This is like a weird interstitial game where I actually have no real idea what's going on. Like, I have a general idea. Okay, there's this kingdom, and I think the emperor turns, and there's a rebellion, and you're kind of working for this rebellion, and people are kind of coming in and out of the rebellion to do all these various things so you can confront the emperor. And that's cool, but I appreciate that they try to do more, because I don't even really know what the fuck the first Final Fantasy game was about at all. It's about these heroes of light. And we were saying at the end, and you have to kind of read into it. It's like, so it never happened. Like, right. Final Fantasy 1 never happened, which is cool. That's actually pretty neat. There's nothing about Final Fantasy 2 that is like that. What I think that this game kind of gets to is an almost Game of Thrones or Final Fantasy 4, like, no one is sacred and we're going to actually kill a bunch of people. The problem is that there's not enough text or love or resonance. The portraits aren't good enough. There's not enough exposition and all of that. I'm not really judging it from that perspective. It's an old game, but none of that resonates like it should. It doesn't quite carry it. You can see what they're trying to do, but it's not until 4, and maybe it's the SNES that allows them to really execute on this in a greater way. It's when I see so many shades of Final Fantasy 4 in this game. It's not even funny.
Yes.
1 and 3 are almost echoes of each other, because they're, as you'll find out, both class-based games, and 3 has a much deeper class system. 4 and then 5 is an echo of that, because that's another class-based game. 2 and 4 and 6 are echoes of each other in their stories, especially 2 and 4. 6 is darker, but treats the characters a little bit more in a more sacred way, I think, by not, well, I don't want to get too spoilery, I guess. But when you think about what happens to Tella or Porum and Palom and others in Final Fantasy IV, that really hurt.
Yes.
And it was like, whoa, man, that's fucking horrible. But here, it's like, wow, he died. This guy sacrificed himself, saving you, but I don't really know who he is. So I know that you tried, but I don't really know exactly. And was what I'm saying making sense to you? They're getting there. They're getting there. You know,
the bones are there.
Yeah.
They tried, but yeah, later on when they get it right, you get to know the character, you're invested, then something happens, then the drama plays out and it hits you emotionally. There's an emotional impact. With this one, they got dark, they got dramatic. There was plenty of death. I remember walking into one town once the dreadnought bombs the various villages, and that you walk in and talk to one little kid NPC. He's like, my mom died. It's like, holy shit, we're getting dark, but it's like dark with no real resonance because you don't even, it's just death and destruction.
Heavy Red Wings in Final Fantasy IV vibe, right? Like
definitely.
The
I saw a
cities
lot of that. Like you can see the beginnings. They're working up that head of steam to get to that point. That's the greatness to come. But it was kind of fun going back and exploring the origins of where they would end up.
Yeah, it's funny because the guy who wrote 1, 2, and 3, I think, was a manga writer who I don't think wrote any of the other. He definitely didn't write the other Final Fantasy games. But you can see that 4 was looking at 2 and 5 is looking at 3 and so on and so forth. And I think that that's a really interesting approach to rapid role-playing development. The expectation that you were going to get these games every year, maybe every year and a half. It's a dream. It's the way we used to feel about, or at least I used to feel about, and I'm reminded of this as I'm playing the Castlevania Advanced Collection now, specifically the third game, Aria of Sorrow, where I'm like, man, we used to get these games every year. This was awesome. We were getting Castlevania games like fucking Madden. It was really weird and awesome. And then they just stopped doing it, and we haven't gotten a Castlevania game in years. And we were in this mode still where I think about Dragon Quest 1, 2, 3, and 4 all the time. It seemed truncated in a Western release date because I don't think 4 came out until 92 in the West. But actually, it was even more truncated in Japan. Those things were coming out in even greater numbers and were resonating with audiences, as you know, to the point where they had to start releasing Dragon Quest games on Sundays because people were, for people that don't know, and you can read about this, it's not really a wives' tale. I think it's probably a little overstated. But when games like Dragon Quest 2 and 3, I think, came out, maybe 3 and 4, people were just not going to school. Like people just stopped. It's very similar to the whole Space Invaders 5 yen coin.
Yes.
That's actually true. And so Dragon Quest games traditionally, I think, still come out on Sundays and in Japan now today because people are so into them. So let me ask you this.
Yeah.
In the West, we have a real role-playing RPG tabletop war game heritage in the United States and in Europe, Canada, other places. But why was it the Japanese that were able to make it next level interesting in a video game? We've gone over this. We had Ultima and stuff, but when you really look at that, no, I don't think so. It's just not. Sorry. I understand how important it is and how good some of the later games are, but why were they the ones to figure this out? And what is it about Final Fantasy that kind of symbolizes that you think? I'm really interested in what you would think about this question, because there's something about Japanese society and both fun and seriousness and all of this that I think they were able to combine all this to really mine role-playing games for all they're worth to this day, actually.
Absolutely, dude. Yeah, it's such a cool question. And I really do think it comes down to the Japanese just know how to make it cool. They know how to merge things together and sort of blend things in a world building set where they'll take, like, we talked about this with Final Fantasy 1, and we've talked about this with a lot of things, a lot of video games in general, but especially with JRPGs, that they'll be really imaginative in the world building, and they'll merge sort of future tech and horror and sci-fi and cyberpunk, and they'll put that in, they'll blend that all together with traditional Tolkien-esque fantasy. So you'll fight zombies, and you'll fight gunslingers, and you'll fight robots, and you'll fight traditional dark elves and dragons and mythological creatures like Medusas and chimeras and stuff. And you'll put it all, and you'll pack it all together. And maybe even one of our protagonists will, very Phantasy Star-esque, will pack a laser sword, or a blaster. And the other one will have a traditional, the dwarf will have a traditional battle axe, and that you kind of, and then you take style and you take Yoshitaka Amano and incorporate style, and you incorporate music and rock music and cool hairstyles and cool hair colors, and you just kind of make it rock. It's not this traditional nerdy thing where you're kind of building this imaginative world, and it's sort of like almost saying like there's something for everybody, but it's still cohesive and it's still fun, but it's incorporating everything, the visual, the gameplay, the music, and you're just packaging this thing that just works on all fronts. But I think at the center of that, it's just making it cool, and it's just making it sort of a no holds barred, like anything could. Let's just incorporate everything that we love. Let's incorporate Star Wars. Let's incorporate Lord of the Rings, shonen manga, whatever anime series we're loving.
Yeah, why didn't Square Enix embrace sci-fi sooner? That's the one, or Squaresoft, I should say. They didn't embrace. Phantasy Star was a contemporary to both Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy.
Sure.
Maybe they didn't want to copy them or something, and they had their own little carve out. But why weren't one of the games a sci-fi game early on? It's so interesting.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
But you see it in the workings of even back then, right? You go into the Dreadnought, it's all future tech and engines and these churning sort of, it's diamond plated steel and carburetors and metallic everything. And this is a fantasy world. We just got out of a castle, a stone castle that was lit with candles. Now we're in this future tech, primitive cyberpunky airship. It's so cool, but they did do it early. I mean, if you think of things like Xenogears, and if you think of things like, I don't know what else you would put in that category, Parasite Eve, and things that were more contemporary, more futuristic or modern, that they did take a chance with that, but you could see it. You really didn't see that. I always credit Phantasy Star for really being the ground zero of that, although it may have existed more subtly or somewhere that was lesser known things. But I love that. I just love that world building. And what's interesting and ironic about that, Kyle? We were already doing that in the West with traditional tabletop RPGs with things like Shadowrun. It's just that nobody thought to merge those things together. Nobody thought to say, why can't the fantasy and the cyberpunk be linked? The Japanese really who did that.
I consider them linked.
I just watched that movie the other day.
Oh, you did?
It was free on YouTube, and then it wasn't like the next day.
Oh, interesting. You can't go wrong with The Patriot. You got to watch it at least once a year.
Never.
Yeah, there's something I just wanted to note on that, because you're right. There, from the very beginning with airships and certain technologies, and certainly it gets to a really major degree in Final Fantasy VI with Nourish and Magitech armor and all the different stuff, which I was obsessed with. I mean, I can't wait to get to that game. I was obsessed with that game when that game came out because of the armor and
so cool
and how they're fusing magic into the armor and into people, and it's so oh my god, we're so. And I felt bad for Dagan, by the way. A little behind the scenes is I was like, all right, so Final Fantasy 3 is next, let's get this on the calendar. And Dagan wrote back and was like, well, this is really my favorite. I really want to spend time with this one and really do it right. And then he wrote back 5 minutes later and he's like, oh wait, wrong Final Fantasy 3. Like he still got the old mentality. And I'm like, we're not even close to that. Although I'm excited to get through 3 because then we get back to 4. And that's when it really begins. I would say 4 is arguably the darkest Final Fantasy game. Although Final Fantasy 7 Remake kind of coming in hot. God, that shit's so good, Dig. You got to play that.
That's interesting. That's interesting to know. I can't wait to play that.
I was disappointed though, because I was listening to something. I don't know. Was it it wouldn't have been Yoshi P. I can't remember. Katase, I guess, was saying that you don't have to have played Final Fantasy 7 Remake to play Final Fantasy 7 Remake 2.
Oh, interesting.
Obviously, they'll do something in the game to make you understand where you're at. But I'm like, what are you saying? The fuck are you talking about? They're continuations of each other. Are we that brain dead today that to play a sequel, you can't first play the first game? Get a grip.
No, I think that would be a miss on the creation's perspective too. Like,
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. I was just going to say, make it. I know the thing is to increase marketability and sell to everybody, regardless of your history. But you're going to get added context from playing the first. You're going to miss something, if you go in not playing the initial offering. Of course.
I just felt this way when Final Fantasy VII Remake came out in 2020, and I was encouraging people, and people were really upset about it to me. I was like, you cannot play this without having played Final Fantasy VII. What is wrong with you? And a lot of people just went in and raw dogged it. And I'm like, that's totally great, but you don't know why it's truly special. You don't get it.
Missing something.
I wish people would take the time more to understand that backstory, because I just had an interesting conversation on our Q&A about how I kind of want to play that series Yakuza, which has been around since the PS2 era, but there's so many of them, and people are like, you should just jump in here, and I'm like, I can't do that. I can't.
Gotta be linear.
I just can't do that. That's such poser energy. The only time I ever brought real poser energy recently was when I played Persona 4 without having played all the other ones.
Okay.
And that was pretty significant poser energy, I thought. So I don't want to up the ante.
I would feel the same way.
Yeah, that's self-regulation though, to an nth degree. All right, let's talk more about Final Fantasy II though. There's so much to say here. I want to begin with the leveling scheme. I'm curious what you think of this. This is the most controversial and contentious part of this game, and it's a major reason why a lot of people don't like this game or don't want to play it, because it is somewhat difficult to have full control over how you're leveling. So for people that are listening but haven't played, and I hope you do decide to play or have played if you've gotten this far, instead of leveling up level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 all the way to 99, instead you level up your individual statistics by using them. So if you cast magic, your mind or whatever stat will go up. If you get magic damage, then something else goes up. If you get physical damage, then something else goes up. If you do physical damage, something goes up. If you get attacked, your hit points, your average hit points will go up, and all these different things, your magic points. It's actually a pretty cool idea. And I imagine that this was pretty sophisticated for the time, but it's not what I want. This is what's so interesting about looking at the taxonomy of Final Fantasy, let's say, is that you can see here that they thought this might be a really good and different way to do things. And clearly they got feedback to the point where they never did that again. And never really messed with leveling until Final Fantasy VIII, I would say, where they really started to screw around with it again, and people got upset about it. Here's what I think, is that I think that they understand the want for complexity, but they don't understand where the complexity belongs. Final Fantasy games and Japanese role-playing games and role-playing games have to have some sort of complexity, but you have to have linear understanding about the way your character grows. That when you level up, so you're going to just get a random assortment of statistical upgrades, and that's going to happen the next time you go over the experience buffer and so on and so forth. It's too weird here. And the problem with it, honestly, and there's a few problems with it, but there's a couple fundamental problems. Number one, and I don't know if you realize this, you could bastardize the shit out of this system. And it reminded me a lot of Final Fantasy Tactics in that sense. I don't know if you remember, if you had a chocobo in your party in Final Fantasy Tactics, it had that 4-way healing spell. Okay. So what you would do is just put 4 of your characters, kill everything on the map except for one enemy, put 4 of your characters around your own chocobo, and then everyone attacks it or attacks each other. And then the chocobo just keeps healing everyone. And so you can just do that forever. There's also a tip in Final Fantasy IV, I think we brought it up on the last episode, where in the Cave of Summons, if you don't kill the summoners, when you encounter them in random battles, they'll just keep summoning enemies, and you can just sit there and kill the summons all day. And I used to do that all the time. You could literally sit there and level up 10 times probably in an hour if you really had the patience. That's cool because there's little ways to break it, and you know that Triangle Island in Final Fantasy VI and Cactars and all that sort of thing. But here it's just begging you to play the game wrong and break the immersion. And that is a design problem. When it becomes clear that it's like, I just attacked myself, or everyone's defending except for one person, then everyone attacks the defending character, right? Or you cast Shell over and over on yourself or whatever to just gain magic, skill and points.
Right.
I don't know if they thought this one through. And it's such that the game never really ever provides a problem. I would argue that this is, it's got to be the easiest Final Fantasy game. It's even easier than the first one.
Yes.
And I think it's because of this leveling system that just busts it wide open. In other words, if you're getting bashed to shit in a battle, you're going to level up your hit points and have a ton more hit points. And it's cool, but I get it, but it's a video game. What do you think?
Yeah. You know what? You make a great point about it being easy. It was a pretty easy. The only thing I did wrong and again, in not consulting any outside sources or guides or anything, was I would wander into areas on the world map that I wasn't ready for, and I would get annihilated by enemies that the first time you encounter them, like I'm hours away from being able to come to this area of the map. But other than that, it was very easy. This whole way of crafting the mechanics of this game, it is very creative in theory. I like the concept, and I like the ambition of just trying something new, especially early in a franchise, especially knowing that Final Fantasy 1 did so well. Going in and say, okay, how can we change it? How can we still be inventive and still make it great, still make it sell well, still resonate with the people that want to play these games? And I like the sort of energy of experimenting. And honestly, this really didn't bother me for two reasons. First of all, at first I thought it was a weird choice because it didn't play well with characters entering and exiting your party. Like having a rotating cast of characters, I thought this was a weird model for that. But then I realized, you know what, maybe it's actually better because you're not spending time on leveling up the character per se, but you're choosing the spells that you want to use and power up and get stronger. You're choosing the weapons. You're choosing the players that you want to buff in terms of hit points. So it was actually kind of worked in tandem with that rotated for the first time experiencing characters coming into the party and then leaving the party. So it worked in that regard. But then also it kind of plays into habits. I'm a very habitual player. I figure out what weapons I like. I figure out I like the bow, or I like the axe, or I like the sword weapons. I like the edge weapons. Maybe I'm going to give this guy a staff. So I figured that out early. I try to stick to it, very set in my way with that. And then I figured out early on, okay, you realize after a few beats, okay, these are going to be the three characters that are consistent. These are the characters that are going to be the mainstays of my party. So let me give ice magic to Maria. Let me give lightning magic to Furion. Let me give
that's how you did
magic to Guy, right?
So that's how you did it. I was going to ask you that. And I just
did, and I leveled up. And every time I encountered an undead enemy, I knew Guy was the one wielding the fire magic, and that he was going to he was going to be the guy in that dungeon or in that area for that segment of the game. And it just, I think because of the way I play JRPGs, and again, just reverting back to old habits, I think it actually worked for me. It didn't really bother me. And it didn't even occur to me, and this may be just being a doofus, it didn't really occur to me that it was so broken until I read about it. And then I was like, that's interesting, because I didn't really even realize, okay, I could attack my own party members if I want to really get them beefed up in terms of HP. Or I want to, I would use Shell, I would use Isuna, I would use Protect, I would use Berserk later on, but I didn't think to abuse them. And again, I think it worked out for me just because I was grinding so heavy. I was doing things for hours at a time that I didn't really need to be doing because I was exploring.
Right.
So I was already getting buffed up. I was way over prepared through most of the game. It wasn't until late in the game where I was becoming a little more on par with the enemies I was facing. I was always way too strong, which kind of made it fun. So it just worked out for me.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear. I was going to ask you, how did you use your characters? Because one of the cool things about this game, it's very Final Fantasy VI like, in that you're given these characters with kind of innate abilities and the understanding, in addition, that you can kind of tune them however you want. I mean, Final Fantasy VI allows you to do that to a much greater level, while Final Fantasy IV, as an example, gives you party members that are, this party member is a ninja, this party member is a mage, this party member is a black magic user, and so on and so forth. So I did dig that entire approach to say, like, there's kind of a archetype here. For instance, what's the third character's name? Where are my notes?
Guy,
right. If you look at his art, you can do whatever you want with him. But right. If you look at his art, I'm like, he has to have an axe in his hand, right? This is what he needs to be using. And my Furion character, the leader, I want him to have a sword, like a real battle sword in his hand. And I threw the female, why can't I remember her name? Hit me with it.
Maria,
right. In the back row. And I want to talk about that because that's the first time that the game introduces rows, which I think is really cool too. which is a big, subtle gameplay addition to Final Fantasy that ends up being really big later on. Something so simple like that. But I did try to stay within an archetype for them so that they all, she used a bow and arrow from the back row, and Guy used an axe, and Furion used his sword. And that fourth roving character, I just never really paid much attention to, because in fact, I used to have that character often defend, because I didn't want to even waste his turn, since I knew he was either going to be out or die until the end of the game. So I didn't even want to waste his turn by him. So he had like a ton of hit points, but would barely be able to do any damage in battle. So that was fun. But it was interesting to hear you discuss how you kind of separated the magic between them, because I was going to ask how you managed that. I gave curing magic to everyone just in case, but I only had Maria as my magic user in the back row. And I'm not even sure if she was really intended to be a magic user or not. It didn't seem like the spells did much damage. Very similar to Final Fantasy 1, you don't really need them.
No.
And there's a few variety of enemies, those kind of gel enemies that you encounter that you need to use magic on, and the golem enemies, the different big enemies that each have meet a wood golem, and you have to use fire on him or whatever. But other than that, I just used physical attacks and everything was totally fine. And I should be clear that though I know you can cheat and the scheme is there, I didn't do that. You don't have to. The game is easy enough. I guess what's funny is that you could just make your guys into a complete series of tanks very early on if you want to take the time to do so, which is cool. And I guess that does tap into Final Fantasy 1's big aftermarket kind of effect, where people would play it in different ways, trying to challenge themselves. And I imagine that you can do the same thing in a different way with Final Fantasy 2, which is cool. I wanted to ask you about another thing that just randomly appears in this game and then goes away, which is this idea of passwords. And I would say that a pretty clear Dragon Quest influence in this game in terms of even the menu that you bring up. It doesn't look the same, but it has the same feel. And what I mean by that, for people that don't know, is in Dragon Quest, you bring up an in-game menu where you can do everything, but it also says things like, search or talk or whatever you have to do, and you do everything through this menu. Calling up a menu with all of these different items where you interact with characters in another meta way is very Dragon Quest, in my opinion. And I liked this touch. It doesn't really mean anything, and you can see they're just trying to do cool things. And it's kind of like, I don't know if you looked at it this way, it's maybe the first or one of the first examples of optional dialogue in games, or choosing your way through conversations. Because there's all sorts of things you have to ask in order to proceed and have to know, but then there's a bunch of things you don't that have to ever ask or know, but you can still interact with all these characters and have optional conversations with them and get information on things you might not otherwise know, and so on and so forth. So again, a little bit ahead of its time. What did you think about this password system?
I thought it was fun. Again, a game of ideas. I think, well, let me clarify. I think the idea is fun to have this key term and key item mechanic. The idea that there's going to be these key items that you really can't sell, that you really can't use, and they're just going to be implemented during major plot points, major story points along the way, milestones. And the same thing with the key terms. I think the key term thing was interesting in that it gets you to engage and talk to the NPCs, a very traditional RPG, JRPG mechanic, where that's part of the exploration, is getting information from the townsfolk, right? But it just becomes annoying, because you have to talk to them, and then you have to press a certain button in order to get that key term. I did that a couple of times, where I would go off to the next adventure, the next part of the world, or the next dungeon, realizing I didn't retain that keyword in my inventory of key terms, and then have to go back because I didn't press the button in order to put that into my menu and then bring it up later. And then it was an interesting idea, but it just becomes a hindrance in terms of fun. It's not fun. It was a cool idea. And again, I think definitely drawn from those older PC text-based RPGs, where that was part of the thing, was thinking through these things and using key words and key terms. And then sometimes they would get you the key item that you need to go on to the next area and proceed and go further. But yeah, I think that it was a good idea, but it was just ultimately like, oh man, it was kind of you would look at a menu and there would be a missing spot, then you realize you can't go on. That was, I think it slowed down the game, I think, ultimately, which, with all these quality of life improvements and mechanics, I like the fact that you could keep that energy and keep it pretty brisk, keep the pace brisk. But this type of thing is just, it plays in more with the original Famicom version, where it's like, you can't have that. I don't know how they would change it or sort of modernize it like they did for the Pixel remasters, but there might be a way where you can make it just a little more user-friendly and a little more fun. But that's what it all comes down to in this game. Some of the ideas are great and they have potential, but it's just not fun.
Yeah, it's a way to keep, it's a way they organize the game, I think. And story beats to have like this all begins when you say this word to this person, and then they give you the information you need to go to the next thing. It's quite linear, and you can see why they did it that way. But yeah, it's a nice idea. I don't need to see that back. I think that just having more dynamic conversations later on with people replaces it entirely. I think another interesting thing, although actually before I even go on, I did want to say, since you brought this up, that the game does suffer from serious pacing issues, I think. And it doesn't even have to do with the password system per se. I think that you're just, especially in the beginning of the game, I noted in my notes here, it's like you're just going from town to town to town to town, going all these transport modes, no dungeons. Like, it's like, what is going on here? Can I play the game? And I felt a little annoyed by the pacing, and it's so annoying to me because I feel like the pacing becomes like one of the things that Final Fantasy becomes good at later on is getting you from place to place and making it feel like a real journey and travels. And they don't do that well in this game.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It's the rhythm. The rhythm's off. There's too much. There's a whole part of the game with like way too much exploration and exposition. And then, it should go village. You don't want it to become rote, but it should go village, dungeon, mix up the exploration and engaging with NPCs with combat, with leveling, with shopping, with powering up, and just sort of have a pattern, right? But this game really gets, it's weird too. Like some of the people that join the party are with the party for a relatively long time, and some of them are in it for minutes. It gets really, really, really strange. There are times in this game where you feel like the game was thrown together in haste and could have been a lot better had they had more time to think it through.
Yeah, why didn't they have more time? It's like, what is the rush, really?
Yeah, what was the rush?
Just because you're making games with such small teams on not a lot of money, and you're making a lot of money. I mean, they're selling 500,000, 1 million copies of the game, plenty of money.
Yeah,
for what you're putting into it. So yeah, like why not give a little more time? But I know that these guys, it's funny to look at games in this era. There was no conception of, and no need, I guess, to take years to make a game, but there was no concept of like, we're going to take a really long time to make a great game. It's like, we're going to make a great game, and it's a market opportunity for us to get it out. So this is when it's coming out. And
right.
That's why I think a lot of games were just half finished and broken back in the day. All right, so let's talk about some of the other things that Final Fantasy II adds to the series for the first time, which I think is fun. One of the things is character portraits, front and back rows, even-handedness, which becomes a bigger thing in Final Fantasy IV, where some of the characters are lefties and some of the characters are righties. And the first guest character appearances that appear in your party with you, non-permanent party members, dying party members, all the rest. I think that it's really an interesting menagerie of new additions that end up kind of sticking around for a while. Did you notice these new additions, these new panaches, and how did you feel about them?
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I love that. You could really, this one much more so than the first, you could see the building blocks, right? You see where they're going. You see the direction they're headed in. The portraits I loved because I remembered in Final Fantasy I, it's like, yeah, you just see your little chibi sprite in the menus, on screen, during battle, on the overworld map. That's all you get. But now you get the portrait, which humanizes the character, and that really plays into having named characters with stories, with backstories, with origins by themselves, and with other playable characters and other parts of the players, NPCs in the world. Having Leviathan, it's like, oh, Leviathan's going to become a thing later on. That was huge. You mentioned Sid, chocobos, just the notion of operatic boss battles, sort of those milestone boss battles with the music, They were kind of events, boss battles being events. Dragoons, you mentioned before.
Mm-hmm.
The birth of the Moogle. In this game, it's the beaver. It would have to evolve, but I saw them as Moogles. It's like, oh, these are going to become the Moogles as they think these through. These are going to become like the little cute little villagers that help you along the way in their own way, that type of thing. I didn't realize the death thing was interesting because not only playable characters or characters that you're very familiar with in the world, but, whole villages. There's people dying everywhere. The drama is, again, I was really laughing to myself thinking 1988, I'm pretty sure I was playing Popeye. But again, just to have that ambition and that cinematic world building in a video game, in an 8-bit video game, I wonder if that could have even been brought to North America intact. There's even some sexual innuendo in this game.
There is.
Right?
There's one specific scene I wrote down where Hilda's in bed and she tries to like woo Firion into bed with her.
And it's evil Hilda.
Right. And it's like the first sexual innuendo in Final Fantasy, probably.
Not only that, but Firion seems like he's kind of going in for it. He's like, what, really? Like, and he walks over to the bed and then she reveals herself as this monster. But it's like, I wonder if that would have made it to North America in, let's say, 1989, a year later. If Nintendo would have heavily censored that, maybe in some ways it's good that we waited 12, 15 years for the game. But so many, really, that's why I think this game should be celebrated, because this was really ambitious for the late 80s. Nobody was doing this yet, where they were like, we can make this video game a serious experience. It's not just about shooting up aliens and high scores. Look what this was as cool as any dungeon master was doing at the tabletop, in Bellport High School at that time, which is, you gotta kind of give the tip of the cap for that.
They do a cool few things with characterization that I did notice in the game, though I had a hard time keeping track of the plot entirely. Not that it's complicated, but it's just, I got to do this. You got to do this. You got to do this. You got to do this. It's like, all right, I get it. But there was one character, I don't know if you noticed, like an old man advisor style character in the throne room. And every time you talk to him, he would talk shit to you. And then you'd come back and you'd be like, oh, I can't believe that you managed to come back. It's really, really funny. Like he talks shit, he's proven wrong, and then he compliments you. And this happens like several times. And I'm like, okay, cool. So they're starting to mess around with although he shares a sprite. He's not like a unique sprite or anything. So you have to kind of just know where to look. I dig that. They do try to fit a few interesting things in there. And I really don't know. I guess it's my own ignorance clearly in some sense, but I just didn't know Mysidia had an origin outside of Final Fantasy IV. That there was this idea of a magic using society or magic using town or village or whatever. And that's a central part to Final Fantasy IV. So does that suggest this is in the same world?
I guess so. It's like a Sid thing. It's like just becomes like this thing that's in every game, like a nod, almost like we have to have this as an Easter egg or something. The Mysidia thing was funny, man. I really was dying to talk to you about this because I ended up going down there so early in the game. I was like, I guess I got to go down there. And I battled, 50 high potions, 50 Phoenix Downs, 50 ethers. Like, it was ridiculous to even think I had to do that yet. And I finally made it there. And then of course, as you get down there, every weapon, every spell is like 50 grand, 40 grand. I have like 3 grand, in my pocket. And that's something interesting about early JRPGs. You can break the linearity of it, but you kind of, an experienced JRPGer should know that I should have known I really shouldn't be doing this. This is going way too far. Like, there has to be an easier way. But I like in these older games that you could still do that. There is a way, if you're willing to go to the wrong place. There's and again, and it plays in. It actually becomes helpful because you're grinding. But the Mysidia thing was a crazy reminder too of just something like a whole town of those cute little mage characters, and something you just said about humor. There was a sense of humor in this game. The biggest moment of that was getting to Leviathan when you meet the Ricard character, the dragoon that got swallowed up. He's in the belly of the beast, and you find all the other people that got swallowed up there, and they have their tables and chairs. Like, it's just like walking into an inn or something.
Right.
and all the furniture set up in the Leviathan's belly or whatever. And it's like, that's funny. That's just kind of cute. It made me laugh. And just to have, you'll definitely see that, again, that cinematic experience of drama and melancholy and humor. It plays out like a movie, and you could see that. You could really see that the beginnings of that here, where they're really trying to do something, something that you would typically see in a comic book or manga or a movie.
Yeah, do you think, let me ask you this about what you're saying. Do you think that this still plays for people that don't have experience in the past? If you gave this to Graydon, would he understand why it's important and why we would think it's good? Or would he be like, or is it like we don't watch talkies anymore and shit or whatever, fucking silent films or whatever? There's some great shit back there, but we don't do it. No matter how good you tell me, oh, that 1924 drama, whatever, you're probably right. It probably was awesome, but it's fucking 100 years old, so I don't care. And I wonder if there's some validity to that, because I have real old man energy with this, where I think one of my advantages in this industry, and while I'll always have a major advantage in the gaming industry if I want to stick with it for the rest of my life, is that I was there. And you can learn things, and I learned a lot, and I filled in holes about different things that I didn't know, but you're there and you take that with you, so it doesn't require education, it's innate knowledge. And when that feeling is lost, I think so too are all the things we truly cared about that weren't replicable or brought to the future. In other words, there's probably a bunch of sci-fi and random TV shows that we love now that really will disappear. Not literally, but just figuratively down the hole, because they won't rise to the level of what people expect or want. And people aren't as interested in history or provenance as we are. So what do you think about that? I mean, is Final Fantasy II a game that you could give to a child today?
It's so interesting. I mean, and just to go along with what you said, you can't fake that either. You can't fake that history, the origins, having been there or going back to experience it for yourself, to get, to see what it was like then and to track the evolution. It's something you can't fake. I think these Pixel remasters so far, 2 games in, I could say this is the best you're going to do at modernizing them to be appropriate enough for people. I don't want to say just young people. Let's just say people that missed them the first time around. Graphically, the music being redone, the quality of life, mechanical improvements. I think these are very playable, two versions in. I don't know. I always think about this in terms of just getting a base in terms of humanity, whether it's young people or just all people. I think of it in terms of like the Criterion collection for movies. Not only are you watching a traditional disc still and not streaming something, but a lot of these movies are older or considered classics, and it's going back to watch them, and whether you enjoyed them the first time around or whether you want to go in and see what all the fuss is about, right? Like, I missed this. Let me see why Citizen Kane is so good, or let me see why this Kurosawa movie or an old James Cagney film or whatever it is, right? I wonder how much curiosity there exists with that around video games, where you want to go back and edify yourself on what came before. I have that. I'm a little bit of not only am I an old man, but I'm a little bit of an old soul. I want to go back and watch the early black and white films. I want to go back and see what the French were producing in the 30s. I want to go back and watch Japanese films from the World War II era. I'm genuinely curious about that kind of thing. I think that certain young gamers could definitely get into these things and have a viable, somewhat modern experience. But someone like for Graydon, my son, he's 12, and the worlds he's immersed in, I don't think that you could get a captive audience with him or most of his peers. I think that is probably too young. I don't know what the age cutoff would be. It's a great question. Maybe somebody, in our orbit, Kyle, like I think of a Chris, I think of Dustin, Micah. They're of very similar ages. they were around when, let's say, the NES or SNES were around or close. So even though they were very little when these things were relevant, there might be something there where at least there's some sort of dynamic of, let me go back and see what this thing was in my living room that my uncle was playing when I was little. But I think for earlier than that, I don't know. I think it would take a very special now 12-year-old kid to go back and tackle these Final Fantasy games. Even in the Pixel Remaster states, I think popular games are just too different now. You know, they don't understand where it came from, and they don't understand the evolution of what these things were coming out of, tabletop RPGs, all that type of thing. You're pretty, even somebody your age, I think, you know, I think it would be tough. I think it would be tough for a lot of gamers depending on what they're immersed in, but it is pretty primitive. It's a pretty primitive model for gaming.
Yeah, it's a good point that things are just different now. So you have to have some sort of extra level of interest or intrigue surrounding something to really want to go back and see the original. And it makes you wonder what the future of these games are from that respect. But certainly they'll always have a place in the history and taxonomy of how we've gotten to this point, which is good. I wanted to ask you about a few other things here that I have in my notes. The economy, again, is just busted in this game. Why do you think it's so hard to manage an economy in a video game like this? You have so much money in this game by some point that it becomes trivial what you're even buying and selling and doing all these different things. But then you have items like the elixir, I think it is, that fills up your HP and MP. That's 50,000 gold. And even when I went to the final dungeon and just spent all my money and I bought like 50 of them, you know, and even just having that many of them breaks the game so majorly to make it as if it's not a challenge at all. Did you notice the broken economy in this again? And why is it so difficult to get this right? I feel like the other games, and we'll get to them and maybe I'll feel differently, but I feel like the other games actually go a little bit in the opposite direction, especially Final Fantasy VI, where you really have to work to, if I would be very OCD with my party, you'd have like 14 members of your party at some point in Final Fantasy VI, and I'd want to get all of their equipment and all of their spells and all that. So I'd write these things down about what everyone needs and how much money I need to earn and all of that. Actually, it's funny because I have a Final Fantasy VI, or Final Fantasy III strategy guide, like from the SNES era, with some of those notes from that time in it that I wrote in the margins.
Awesome.
Like all prices and stuff that I needed to earn. So I've always been obsessed with that. And I felt like that was a real grind. In other words, there's no grinding in this game, which I think might be attractive to people, but there's really no need. The busted experience system and the busted economy make it such that they're not really coming together as a confluence of rewarding you for a job well done. So what was your interaction with the economy?
Yeah, you could stay upper middle class in this game pretty easily. Everything's pretty affordable. Again, because I was so grind heavy and so exploration heavy and not consulting guides and stuff, I always had enough money. So my methods played fortunately into my circumstances. So I never had a problem with money. But you could tell, first of all, what's with the innkeepers? It could be 23 gil a night to stay somewhere. Then you go to the next town, it's like 400 gil.
I think it's based on, I think, where you are plus what you need to heal.
Oh, that's
how I figured it out, I think, was like, it was totally a math equation in the back end of this is how damaged you are.
I never realized that.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That would make sense instead of
not really. I mean, it's kind of stupid when you think about it, but yeah, fair enough.
Why are you guys ripping me off? That's how I felt the entire
It's
game.
like going to fucking Days Inn down the street and you go and you're like, man, can I use a room? And they're like, sure. And they're like $100. I'm like, and then you'd go in the next day and you're like, can I get a room? I'm really tired. And they're like, sure, it's $150. Doesn't really make a whole lot of sense.
I thought they were being fickle with me. Like I would go in and say no, and then I would go back and it would be, and then I was like,
oh, really? So maybe it's more than that. But I did notice
it doesn't change when you do that.
Well, okay, it doesn't. Because I noticed that one time that I basically was just I used I got hit once in some incidental battle, went back to a town. I was like, fuck it, I'll just heal. And I think I paid like 21 gil or something to stay at the hotel. So at that point, I realized that there must have been more to it than that.
That's really interesting. And the other thing is, if you do take the time to really explore the dungeons, which can be aggravating in this game, you'll get a lot of the weapons. You'll get some items, but you'll get a lot of the weapons and some of the armor that you would otherwise have to buy. So just like the first game, sort of the same dynamic. So if you explore a little bit and really scour, you'll save yourself some money. But yeah, just because I was grinding so heavily, Kyle, I never really wanted for money. I would buy, 50 ethers at a time, 50 Phoenix Downs. They did balance the economy by charging a lot for cabins and tents, Phoenix Downs. As you said, elixirs were expensive. Even the ethers, high potions are a little pricey. So you did, if you wanted to really stock up and do straight 99s and really be OCD like we do, then you had to grind a little bit maybe. But otherwise, you could definitely get by. The other thing you realize in this game, if you're an experienced JRPG or jumping into this for the first time, it's like you're really trying to cross your T's and dot your I's in terms of stocking up items. I need 50 high potions. I need 100 regular potions. I'm just going to spam those when in the heat of battle or whatever. And then you realize, as you said, Kyle, the game is so easy that you don't need to do that. But because you spent the first few hours being so prepared, that definitely has a waterfall sort of domino effect for the rest of the game, because you started out having all these things that you never really needed anyway. So as you fight stronger monsters and get more gil from battle, you're just amassing a fortune, basically, that you never really do need. You figure, and it plays along. If you figure out the spells and the weapons that you're going to really concentrate on really beefing up and stick by that plan, even if you change it a couple of times during the course of the adventure, then you're golden. It's definitely a little too easy. It's not until Final Fantasy IV, and again, we'll experience 3 next, but Final Fantasy IV, I remember being much more challenging with that. And then, of course, later with 6, when you have so many more characters to manage, it gets even trickier. But again, you could see the beginnings, and you could see that they probably would have been able to balance that economy a little more had they had more, or given themselves more time to develop the game, because it's just way too easy. But I wonder how much of that is intentional, especially in bringing and thinking they're going to bring these to the West and not wanting to turn people away from a relatively new thing still, where it's like people, I could see, I wouldn't have been this way. I was already a little older too, but I could see Western players being really aggravated if these games got too hard too fast. We had to kind of get our feet wet a little bit, I feel like. So I wonder how much of that was intentional too, where it's like, we'll make it too hard for those pansy Americans, that whole Super Mario 2 dynamic.
Sure.
Where it's like, they're not ready,
Sure. Yeah. What an insult. We probably weren't. Do you ever think about what would have happened? Do you think that there's some sort of inflection point with Super Mario Brothers 2 where things would have gone differently in the West if they released the lost levels as the real Super Mario Brothers 2? Do you think that would have mattered?
So. I don't think so at all. People loved the first game so much that getting more of that, I was more enamored with getting something new. I thought that was so cool. It's like the jump from the first Zelda to the second Zelda, or Castlevania: The Simon's Quest. I always like that, an inventiveness and just trying out something new. We talk about that a lot on the show. But I think if they had released quote unquote lost levels as Super Mario 2, I think it would have done very well. I don't think you could have gone wrong with anything Super Mario Brothers at that point.
Yeah, I'd love to know
now, but especially then.
What would happen if you just swapped those 2 games in the West?
Interesting.
Well, think about the Mario 2 Nintendo Power cover.
Sure.
So now that's gone.
Yeah. Issue number 1.
And yeah, so little things like that disappear. But of course, they never put Wart into Super Smash Brothers. So fucking idiots. I'll never respect Nintendo because of that, ever. I don't care what they do. I'll never respect Nintendo for that. No one in that room said we should put Wart in this game.
It's so weird.
Okay, guys.
It's so weird. I wonder if that's still owned. Fuji is still...
Right, we went into that, right? That there might be ownership issues that they couldn't figure out. They got Solid Snake in the game.
Everything. Think of Namco's properties, Sega's properties, Square's properties.
Famous Nintendo-centric character Cloud Strife is in the game. When that happened, I was like, why is Cloud in this? What does he have to... Dude, Solid Snake is really pushing it, but I'll give you the Twin Snakes, okay? Cloud?
Very interesting.
Poser
Capcom's IP, Konami's IP, everybody else. I think Fuji, I don't know what Fuji's doing right now. Are they still doing?
We'll see.
They're electronic. I know they were heavily associated with cameras,
right? Fuji, what the fuck is this?
Or did they go to the way of Kodak? I don't know.
Fujifilm Holdings Corporation, or simply Fuji, is a Japanese multinational conglomerate headquartered in Tokyo, operating in the realms of photography, optics, office, and medical electronics, biotechnology, and chemicals.
Oh.
They have 73,900 employees.
Oh. So they're bigger than Nintendo. Okay. Got
They could figure it out. I'm pretty sure they could figure it out. What a waste. Him and Dr. Wily, those were always the ones. Where was Dr. Wily? Where was the Pokemon trainer Dr. Wily character? Come on. I just gave it to you. I gave it to you years ago.
That is a weird one. That's a weird omission.
I would have loved that where he's just in the background and the robots are fighting for him. And maybe he has 3 or 5 options like Pokemon trainer did. I think he had 3 or whatever. That would be super fun.
I can't even think of a better one than that, to be honest.
Yeah, who else would even be missing? There are a few amiibo that I have to get still that I'm missing because on my back shelf there, you can probably barely see it on the camera, but I have my amiibo. I only buy amiibo for characters I really like. Rosalina, I got that amiibo.
I didn't know you were a Rosalina fan.
Oh yeah, I have a big crush on Rosalina.
How do you feel about Daisy?
She's fine. She's fine. But when I first played, it was so funny because when you think about Super Mario Galaxy and her hair that like goes in front of her face, I'm like, that is such a emo sign of the time haircut. It's just so funny how you can always date Super Mario Galaxy based on her character's
absolutely
look.
Yeah,
but I always loved her. But yeah, there are a few that I'm missing. Let me see. Yeah, like I don't have the ice climbers, which I really want. Here, I'll tell you the ones I have. Let me see. I have all the Shovel Knight ones, so we can say that.
Oh, cool.
Toad, of course, who's one of my favorites.
Nice.
Mega Man, of course. Jigglypuff, of course. Mario, of course. Yoshi, of course. Dr. Mario, of course. Toon Link.
Nice. I love that one.
King Day-to-Day. Duck Hunt, which is probably my favorite one of those in terms of the way it looks. That one is so beautiful.
Yeah, I love that one too.
Bowser, Kirby, and Ganon. So I'm missing, and I have the 8-bit Mario one as well.
When you say Toon Link, that's
I'm
Wind Waker
missing
Link?
the Castlevania ones. I don't have those.
Those are cool.
I'm missing.
Those are really cool.
Cloud. I would need him. Snake, I'd probably want to get.
Yeah,
I bought a lot of these secondhand too. So I think I'll have to do that at some point.
No Little Mac.
No Little Mac. I would need him.
I don't have him either. No Ryu.
Oh yeah, Ryu. That would be interesting. I forgot he was in. How did that happen?
I have no idea, but I love it.
He does have a heritage with Nintendo, no doubt.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I'm not questioning that, but so there's much work to do in that sense. I need to get the weird, creepy Wii Fitness lady. That's a funny character though.
I love it.
But yeah, I don't want to get all of them because like Dustin has all of them and it's cool. He has a really cool shelf with all of them on them in his house, but I don't care about all of these characters. I don't want to give you the wrong idea and have you think that I care about all of them.
You got to get the ones that are meaningful for you.
Can I tell the difference between any of the Fire Emblem characters? You know I can't.
Oh, I can't.
They're all the same. And when they're added to the games, I get so mad because it's like, how many more of these same characters are we going to put in this game? While Wart and Dr. Wily remain on the outside looking in. All right, let me see here. Dave, we talked a little bit about this earlier, but let's go a little bit deeper into this if we can. About death, about temporary party members, and how this all kind of works out. How did you feel about this? Did they use death maybe a little too much? 4 people, I think, die in this game, which is more than any of the other ones. Unless I'm mistaken, right? 4,
Let me see.
No, like that, not even close. In fact, I think Porm and Palm don't really die either. So
that's right. They come back.
So, well, whatever. I mean, it's
Spoilers.
1991. So what did you think about the introduction of death, and was it used too much? And again, as I said at the top, I think that it's cool to use the finality of death and the emotion of it. But at the same time, we're not quite there yet with the presentation where it seems weird. It's why, I was thinking about this actually. I'm playing the game. I was playing the game Bat Boy, which I highly recommend.
Oh yeah.
It's fucking awesome. It's awesome. And I platinumed it this past weekend. And the boss, I don't think this is really a spoiler. I don't think anyone really cares. There's a lot of odes and homages in the game to a lot of other games.
Oh, sure.
And the boss at the end begs for your forgiveness, like bows and forget. And that was what was funny about Dr. Wily. That's an ode to Mega Man. And that's why it's funny. In fact, the Dr. Wily statue I have on my shelf back there, people can see it, is him begging for Mega Man's forgiveness. Because that's the way Mega Man games ended. And it was funny because they couldn't really, what were they going to do? Was Mega Man going to blow his head off? Does he go to a fucking war crimes tribunal or whatever? No, it's like it's a fucking 8-bit game. He begs for mercy. They throw him in jail. He gets away and there's another game. They don't really get too crazy and serious with it. And I think that levity is kind of fun. That lack of levity is why I think that a remake of Mega Man, making it much more serious, would be really cool and timely, especially in 3D, which I would love to lead Capcom one day if you wanted me to do that. I'll even move to Japan to do it.
That's so cool.
But
great idea.
But so I don't know if that games like Mega Man really captured as much of the moment as they possibly could and never really got too serious. When games started to get serious, like Castlevania, it was maybe through the graphics and the horror and all of that. Ninja Gaiden through very wonderfully done, futuristic, very ahead of their time cutscenes. Here, I just think it's kind of lost the heft. It's like, this guy's dead. It's like, all right. I mean, I don't, but we barely knew him. So I'm wondering how did that play for you? The people just dying left and right.
I wonder how this would have played if we didn't have all this historical context. Like if you and I didn't play 4 and 6 and 7 and beyond, and just played these in order dating back to the late 80s, how it would have played. We probably would have loved it. Now knowing what these games are capable of and looking back in a sort of retconny sort of fashion, or out of context or out of sequence, I think it's a little different. I like, everything you just said about tone, stakes, wouldn't really work in a Mario game, wouldn't really work in a Mega Man game, but you named some good examples. Ninja Gaiden's a great example. Castlevania is a great example, whether you're dealing with action or political intrigue in Ninja Gaiden's case.
Yeah, Ninja Gaiden, the CIA and all that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it goes along with that story. Or you think of like the Golgo 13 games, right? Conspiracy, government intrigue, warring countries.
I was so lost in those games when I was that game.
They were so confused.
I had no idea that they were based on things too until I was older. I had no idea.
Yeah.
No idea. It's like, why did Golgo 13 get a Western release?
So weird.
Because it's based on some weird Japanese shit that no one, or something like that.
It's based on manga, and some resulting anime. But yeah, Duke Togo. I mean, it's kind of that wasn't even like as far as I know, like a shonen manga. So that was a kind of a obscure even in Japan. But one of those things. They just kind of did it. That's what I loved about video games of that era. Like they didn't really make that much sense, but yeah, I like the drama. Right. I like the gravity. I like characters sacrificing. And they also make for a really hateable bad guy, a really important, or a baddie that you really feel the protagonist has to get the better of. They have the best as baddie. But unfortunately, all the death and destruction sort of reads like a melodrama because we don't know the characters that well. First of all, they do a thing in this game where the side characters, the sort of glorified NPCs and the characters that rotate in and out of your party are much more interesting than the main party members because we know more about them. We know more about their struggles, their stories, their origins. We don't really know that much about Furion, Maria, and Guy. We just know, Guy's like this barbarian type that doesn't speak good English. He could communicate with animals. Maria's some sort of archer, thief type elf proxy, and Furion's the leader. That's really all we know. He's an orphan, like all their parents died. That's all we know. The characters that come in and out of the story are much more interesting. You got the thief Paul or Sid. I thought Minwoo was a cool character. Layla the pirate. Like these are much more interesting characters. But unfortunately, even the characters that die, we get Scott and Joseph. Minwoo eventually bites the dust. Sid. I think Tobul eventually dies, the King of Finn. We don't really know them that well. So you're filling this game with all sorts of stakes, but it's like, who is this random person we're supposed to care about? That's the feeling you get. But when I project another few years to something like Final Fantasy IV, and then of course later to 6, that's where it'll culminate in something really meaningful, where they really have that character building. They take the time to really introduce us and get us invested in the characters. Then you put them in harm's way, or God forbid, kill them. Now it becomes just as much of a tearjerker as any movie or novel you've ever read, right? It becomes just a good story, built and woven from good characters. But they don't have that yet. They have the stakes without the investment, which is kind of weird, but I like where it's going. You know, of course, now we know if we played this in 88, we'd have no idea where it was going. But now playing it in 2023, we know exactly what they're building here. We know that this is the skeleton for something great to come. So I think that kind of gives it a pass in a little bit of way. And also, again, you just compare it to what else was available at this time. This is so much deeper than any video game experience, virtually anything we had at this point. So just the fact that they're trying to push in that direction is really cool. And I always think of this just working in an animation studio perspective. I think of the accountants, right? I think of the bean counters, the number crunchers, the people in charge of the bottom line. And the fact that they were allowed to do this or got away with it, I don't know. But I think that's kind of cool, you know, because I could see being an executive and being like, really, is this, I thought like Space Invaders, or, you know, I'm going a little too far back, but you know what I mean? I thought, you know, this seems a little bit, are kids going to like this type of thing? And they put it in there. And maybe this is that flashpoint. Maybe this is ground zero where games really were starting to be made for older kids / adults. Maybe this was the part where video games started to be for other people besides 8-year-olds. And that the weird thing is I can't even see an 8-year-old enjoying this. You know what I mean? I think it's a little too deep for an 8-year-old. I'm not sure they want to get invested in something like this. So yeah, it's kind of cool.
The flexible party situation is an interesting idea, but yeah, they just went too far with it. Because when I think about guest characters later on, we brought up Tella in Final Fantasy IV. You have characters who's not really even a guest character, but you have real guest characters like in 6, like General Leo and Bannon, where they join your party for a little while and it's actually really meaningful to the story and it's super cool and exciting and it's very temporary and ephemeral. They just, in this game, instead of giving you a 4th character until the end, they just are like constantly bringing new guys in, and it kind of ruins the idea of what a party is. I don't mind having 8 characters in a party as long as you have them within the first half of the game and that they're always accessible to you. So in other words, I think they were trying new things, as you said, and then they just went a little too far with it.
Yeah, the game's too short for this many characters. And it's not that many characters, but for this many characters, you're really trying to squeeze them in too short of a time frame. So we can't get to know anybody. And if you want to have the thing where the pirate gets replaced by the dragoon and the dragoon gets replaced by the thief, and then the thief gets replaced by the monk, then, you know, it's too much. You got to kind of simmer down a little bit. You're trying to do too much and in too short of a time. And it just reads a sloppy, I guess.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about magic too. We had brought it up earlier. The spell system in this game is cool, but it's also broken. And now I could be wrong on this. There could be something I'm missing and I wouldn't be surprised, but am I interpreting this right? That it is necessarily so that the more you use a spell, the more powerful it gets,
yes,
and the more expensive it gets to use, and you can't turn it back. So there's like a fine line where you almost want to have multiple fire spells going on different characters, because it's like I have Fire 16, which is the most powerful one, and you have to use it. You can't use any other one, and it's 16 magic points. So it has a pretty steep cost. I thought this was a very strange, seemingly broken aspect of the game, and I thought I must be missing something. And maybe I am. Maybe someone's going to write and say you can change it. But I was like, certainly there must be a way to go through the different spells. This is why you don't need 16 iterations of the same spell. That's why I like the old days of Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, or Fire Aga, Fire Aura, or whatever.
Sure.
Where you just have 3. Can't we just have 3? 16 is a lot. And making that, and even when you had Fire Aga, you could still use Fire if you wanted to. So I thought this was a somewhat broken situation that it didn't allow for enough nuance. It forced you to basically have roving spells on different characters and not use them. And I again, like I remember saying this about Final Fantasy 1, and I know I said it earlier about Final Fantasy 2 as well, but it just doesn't seem like magic is very useful in these games. And that's so different than the way it becomes later on. Although to what you said earlier, I did use a lot of the gray magic, like protect and shell, but that's about it. So am I interpreting the magic system right? There seems to be a flaw there.
I think you're right. I don't think, to my knowledge, you can't step it back. So if you get to a Fire 5, you can't step it back to a Fire 4. The only thing you could do if you want less powerful fire magic that draws less MP, you could give it to another character and just not use it as much. So if you get to Fire 6 and you really don't need it for a specific, if you're backtracking and you're in a place where you don't need it, you could use that other character, could have Fire 2. You could call that up and you could even designate it to all the enemies, and it'll take less MP up. But I never really struggled with it because I knew who my lightning guy was. I knew again who the fire guy was. I knew who the ice guy was. I knew who was going to be. I would give protect and life and cure to everybody, so everybody would have it. And of course, there was some disparity because it would just so happen that Maria would be the one to cast them and they would get stronger with her. But you just try your best. But that's the thing, too. Your weapons, your dedicated weapons get so strong that until much later in the game, I felt like I didn't even need my magic. It was overkill for most of the adventure. I got to Fire 6. Maria had Fire 6 relatively early because I was using it so much. By the time I got to the middle of the game, I was wiping everybody out with it. Even if I applied it to all 8 enemies on the screen, like it would just take everybody out.
That's a new addition to this game as well that stays in all Final Fantasy games, that you can click over to the left or to the right, depending on if you're using white or black magic, to cast it on everyone.
Multicast.
Which is, exactly. Which is a huge... I remember discovering that on accident in Final Fantasy 4. I didn't even know you could do that.
We've been
and then you just
long.
pressed over like one too many times, and then you have the flashing pointing things at all the enemies. I'm like, wait, what is this?
Wait, you could do this?
Yeah, it was huge. It was a revolution.
I love it so much. The only thing really for me with the magic, less so than how it worked, was just there wasn't enough of it. It was boring. I was channeling like, where's Rydia? Where's my summoner? And we'll get there. Mm-hmm. But that's the one thing, is that it's still a little boring. It's still a little pedestrian. I want something more exciting. If I'm going to use the magic, then let me, even with the fast forward button, if I'm going to go through the pageantry, let me have something. Let me have a proper payoff. You know what I mean?
One thing I wanted to ask you about that I think I was very happy to see, and that I was reminded began in this game, as I noted earlier on in our episode, is the chocobo. And I've always been very, very attracted to the chocobo, not sexually, but just as an idea. Oh, I don't have it. I don't know where. I might have sold it. I don't think I did. I don't know where it is. I had a chocobo stuffed animal that I don't know why it's on my shelf, because I have my cactar back there and all those other things. But I really love the chocobo. And I don't know if you've been paying attention to Final Fantasy 16. When we're recording this, and when we'll publish it, we'll be on the precipice of the game coming out. But they have chocobos in it, obviously. And I love the evolution of this animal to being what I think was always supposed to be. The intent was this horse-like, ostrich-like bird that is the beast of burden in this world. And they're introduced here, and you can ride around, and they're really cute and all that. But I just love the design. I love the character. What do you think about the staying power of the chocobo, which began all in Final Fantasy 2?
It's an icon. You can't even imagine video games or pop culture or nerd culture without this thing. And, for Final Fantasy, like the Cactuar, like some other things we talked about, this is the cute. This is the levity. This is the whimsy of the world. And those little things, even with something like this where it plays into melodrama and you get to the town, it's like everybody's dead, and they were like everybody that was outside, the dreadnought came and bombed, everybody that was outside's dead. It's like, what? And then, you know, in a couple of breaths, you get reminded it's a video game. It's cute. You get the chocobo. And the other thing, one of the great frustrations for me in this game was the airship wasn't really at your behest like you want the airship to be. In a Final Fantasy game, you had to pay for it. You had to go to that specific town and grab it. Then you had to pay for it depending on where you wanted to go. You don't really get that quick travel without the burden of the way too frequent random encounters until you get that chocobo. So chocobo is a proper payoff in this game because you really want it. You really want to get to it. And, you know, it's adorable, man. It's like that getting to that little beaver village. It's a reminder that it's like Ewok Village, right? It's like all this serious stuff is playing out. The Empire is battling the rebellion, but you have these cute little teddy bears. That model, I'm a Gen Xer, man. That model just works for me.
Yeah. Do you like the more serious adaptation of it in Final Fantasy 16 where it's a much more, it's grounded?
Yeah, I've seen that.
I think it's not the first time they've done that, but I think I love it personally.
You have to adapt it for tone. You're not going to have the cute chocobo in Final Fantasy 16. Final Fantasy 16 is a whole nother thing now. You know, this isn't little chibi sprites, and it's not the beginning. This is a different style. It's like what you do with Zelda, right? You could take a stylistic departure from Wind Waker to Tears of the Kingdom. And I feel like the same thing about Final Fantasy. I feel like Final Fantasy could revert back again from Final Fantasy 16. But I like being able to kind of play the staples into the mold of what the specific tone is. That's fun.
Yeah, I'm trying to find. Yeah, here it is. I'll send this to you in the.
Let me check this baby out.
Open image, a new tab. There we go. Yeah, in the chat here.
Okay.
Just that's a screenshot from the new game. You can actually zoom in on it if you want, but yeah, it's just cool because it just feels real. And they did a little bit of this in Final Fantasy 14, I know, and certainly in Final Fantasy 15 as well. But I just love the look of it. It's not bright yellow. It's not. They ground it. It has like I just love the idea of it having. And again, I know didn't start here, but I love the idea of it having a saddle. The saddle has like a dagger on it. It's just so cool. I see that.
That's so cool. Yeah, but it's still, and of course they took out the cartoony yellow, but it's still somehow a chocobo, right? It's still a chocobo, and you're playing it in. You're keeping it instead of just not having it. You're still putting it in there and making it work. It's just a different presentation. That's smart. That's really cool.
A few more odds and ends I wanted to ask you about before we go, and we can also touch on anything that you feel like we didn't talk about. What did you think about the constant automatic modes of travel in the game? The idea of paying to go places and all of this, I felt it's a little ahead of its time, but also kind of ruins the idea. It's the difference between, this is a little bit of a weird take, but it's the difference between Grand Theft Auto 3 and the Getaway, where you would get into a car in the Getaway and it would take you where you were going, or you would just go where you're going. And the Grand Theft Auto 3, it's like, no, like, have a little go however you want, have a little bit of time to explore and hang out. And I feel like it was a little weird to make it so automatic. You didn't have to do it that way. And a lot of times it was optional if you use those ships. But even getting on the Chocobo, it's annoying because you have to go find the Chocobo forest. There's only one of them. And then when you get off of him, he just runs back to his forest. So he's gone forever.
That's right.
So it just felt a little stymieing. I was curious if you noticed that.
Yeah, I don't mind structure in my JRPGs, but I don't want it with exploration and travel. Like, let me roam the world. Let me get to that airship or get to that chocobo, get to that milestone in the game where it opens up the world to me. I don't have to be hindered by the encounters, and I could really explore. So yeah, I thought it was a little annoying that that you had to pay, that you had to go to a certain place to secure the vehicle or the chocobo or whatever. Yeah, that doesn't really work for me. I wonder, again, I understand playing around with how these things are going to work early in the franchise, but I do wonder if it was a memory restriction with this game too. Like if you could just hop in the airship and go wherever you wanted, albeit this is a pretty small game in terms of scope. The world isn't that large, but I wonder if that had something to do with it, if that was sort of setting a limit on being able to go where you wanted, when you wanted. But I think that becomes later on, just a little later on, that becomes such an essential part of Final Fantasy. And again, not necessarily from the beginning. I like having limits from the start and having to earn it. But then once I earn it, let me have it. You know what I mean? So I could then go on and really kind of see what I want to see and do what I want to do type of thing. So it just feels like there should be that you should set that limit early on and then open it up. Let me earn passage. And this game doesn't do that. It was quite annoying. Especially because the random encounters are so frequent. Unless you could do something with the random encounters where you could make them somehow, I guess, get less and less earn the right to make them less and less frequent somehow. I'm not sure what that mechanic would entail, but because you're so burdened with walking, sometimes, you can't even get to a treasure chest across the room without having another random encounter in this game. And that sometimes that just, again, that stymies the rhythm and the progression and just the pace.
Yeah. It's, again, the beginning, in some way, I feel like we're earning the later games by getting through these. Not that they're bad. I'm really enjoying playing them and playing them again and getting the platinum trophies in them. But now we have to just get through Final Fantasy 3, the real Final Fantasy 3, which is not just getting through, but that's when the series, I think, starts to get much meatier. It's a pretty big game with a lot more to do in it. So that'll be interesting. But once we get through that, then we get to 4 and finally 5. And then later in the year, we'll get to 6. And I think that's when we're really, I don't know. I don't want to set a limit on it or an expectation, but you can imagine the 6 conversation going on for a really long time. There's so much I want to say about that game. I've never, ever, ever done a proper conversation about Final Fantasy 6 in my life because I've never really been on a show with anyone that has played it.
Yeah.
I can't even convince Dustin to I think he wants to, but and I know Chris tried it, but people that really like role-playing games, I think they're still kind of turned off by the chibi nature of it. So I think they would especially be turned off by the NES and Famicom era of these games like this. But we're slowly getting through this stuff so that we can really, really get to the meaningful conversations.
Absolutely.
But that's the last thing I wanted to say was, in tying into that, is that the origins of political intrigue and stuff start here too. It's kind of funny to think about Final Fantasy without that. But Final Fantasy 1 really didn't have any of that. It didn't have much of a structure and a story. And this game being about a rebellion and all of this puts it right in line with 6, really. And in some way 4 as well, although the 4 is more about a redemption and character change and all of that. So I like here too that, again, and we've mentioned this many times on the show already, but I just wanted to put a fine point on the politics, specifically the small p politics of just the world, and that they tried to do something that meant something that was cohesive and had a history and a meaning. I appreciate it. It doesn't quite resonate, but I think it probably did at the place and time in which it was released. And I'm sorry that we didn't. I'm sorry that Squaresoft was so short-sighted to not understand that they could have continued to sell NES games and still sold SNES games as well, and that they could have gotten all these games out here, but they still never. They just didn't understand. Even after 4 came out as 2, they still didn't understand. They were like, 5, me. And same thing with Dragon Quest. We didn't get any of that stuff.
No,
we didn't get 5 or 6 on Super Famicom. So something was up there, and that was NX, of course, but at the time. But so anyway, is there anything we didn't touch on, Dig, as we begin to wrap up that you'd like to discuss?
No, I mean, I like this as, this game, again, you got to kind of give it the nod as they were on the right track. Later on, they would flesh it out, but they were definitely starting to show the signs of creating characters that were compelling and building worlds that were immersive. And this is really it's kind of cool to go back historically and see where really that all started. There was just one question I wanted to ask you that occurred to me about the combat that I honestly thought about in Final Fantasy 1, but I had the same idea, just a little more fleshed out when I played this second game. And that, in the turn-based combat, I almost think, because in turn-based combat, right, we both love classic JRPGs. We don't really mind it, but there's something I feel like maybe you could improve it a little bit by just having a little more to do during the combat. So there was something to me about saying, like, look, designate which character is attacking which enemy right? Instead of just grinding the same, ding, attack, and then if the first character dies, it'll automatically go to the second character. In other words, if you try to attack a character that's already dead, wouldn't it be interesting if you actually whiffed? So the first character kills the first enemy, and you already assigned that enemy to the second character too. Well, if that character's already dead, wouldn't it be interesting if the second character actually whiffed because you didn't take the time to designate him to the second enemy? And then there's some strategy at play there because you have to figure my character is this strong, this specific enemy is this strong, so how should I work it out with who attacks who, right? Also, wouldn't it be kind of interesting if you did just spam attack, then it could carry out and you could have some sort of auto mechanic, which it does, which says, okay, if the first character dies, the second playable character, my second party member, will automatically attack the next enemy and not whiff on the first now dead enemy. But if you do take the time to designate who attacks who, it's actually a stronger hit. So you could actually fly through a battle if you need to, but if you really want to have a more powerful attack that lands and takes away more HP from the enemy, then you'll come in and designate. I kind of wished for that the first two games because it's one thing to get through the game quickly, but it's another thing to be more invested when you have more to do, if that makes sense. And I wonder, maybe, and I may be ignorant, maybe that mechanic or those mechanics do exist in other role-playing games. But I always thought that was an interesting idea, and maybe it could even be a little more inviting for people that are turned off by turn-based RPGs that just say that's a little too, that's boring to me. That's like playing a board game. I don't want to do that type of thing. So what do you think about that? Are those ideas that would be appealing to you? Or
yeah, specifically the idea of aiming at individual enemies. I think and then that enemy being killed by a previous attack. There is something cool about the idea of saying if you're casting a spell on that person, it just misses.
Yeah.
But I think the argument is that in the course of realism, in a turn-based situation where everyone is going one after the other, why would the person attack nothing?
That's why
wouldn't
point.
He just go and attack the other creature or the other enemy? So I think that would be interesting, but that's probably just a quality of life feature that would probably turn people off. I'm trying to think of games that do that.
That might actually have the reverse effect. It might actually make it worse.
Maybe even, I don't know, does Dragon Quest do that? I don't know. I don't think so. I know that there are 3D role-playing games like Trails of Cold Steel and others that would do what you're talking about, but that makes a little bit more sense in that space and in the way those games operate. But yeah, there is something stilted and automatic about the gameplay. It makes you wonder. I would love to know when they didn't focus test these games probably at all, but when they were writing these up and figuring out what they wanted to do with them, it would be interesting to know what is the fun aspect of the game? Like, why do you guys think this is fun to play? And I would wonder what the answer would be to that. It seems like a very fundamental question and a stupid question, but is it fun to just be tapping the button over and over again? But I was doing the same thing, especially with the quality of life features in Pixel Remaster, where I was just attack, defend. It usually was, like I said, with the last one. And then I would just hit square and it would just pop through everyone and then just be done into the next one. And I find that pleasant because what I find fun out of the game is the grind, the progression of the story, the progression of the characters, finding new places to be and all of that. So
sure.
But I wonder if what they would say is if the fun is supposed to be in the gameplay itself, I would say they probably failed there. And I think that they would not answer that way anyway.
Yeah. And the management and sort of being ready for battle and what you do, your decision making, that's the rewarding and satisfying aspect that I think people don't realize about JRPGs. It's not playing an action platformer, for example. It's really not until later on with, I think, if I'm not mistaken, right, Kyle, with Final Fantasy VI, where you're employing timely Street Fighter mechanics, dragon punches and fireballs and hurricane kicks to the combat that really elevated JRPGs for me, where it was, and also, of course, the Secret of Manas and Chrono Triggers, where you are actually fighting, in an action styled scenario where it's not turn-based, where you go to an action screen or you're in an overworld screen where you're just doing combat, Link to the Past style, right? But you have those different options. But this is a very traditional turn-based JRPG. And it's interesting to think how you could elevate the craft and elevate those mechanics a little bit. And like you said, sometimes maybe those ideas, like this game does in other aspects where you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. It's a good idea in concept, but when it plays out in the flesh, maybe it just doesn't work for whatever reason. But they were still experimenting in the late 80s with this, and that's what makes it so cool. They were still inventing this whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
It was brand new.
Yeah, and they were doing their own thing. It's so fun to look, as I noted earlier, in Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, and Phantasy Star all side by side. They're all really doing something different, and I would argue that Dragon Quest and Phantasy Star are much more closely associated than Final Fantasy is to either of those games. So you do have to give it up to Squaresoft because even when you think about Phantasy Star and Dragon Quest, they're even using the same perspectives. Final Fantasy just even changes perspective. And that alone, I think, is a major change. That we think about the characters going back and forth, the cute chibi characters, is a little bit more of a cuteness to the game, them using their weapons and then like backing up back into their row. It's very, very cute. It only gets cuter from here, which I'm also pleased about. And there's something that marriage of all of that, I think, it's not quite yet developed in Final Fantasy II. They wouldn't be able to capture it on the NES anyway. They barely capture the essence of what would become Final Fantasy with Final Fantasy IV, but it's definitely there. And then by the time you get to 6, they really know what they're doing. So yeah, there's much more to discuss, but that was Final Fantasy II. I encourage people to, and I know Dagan said this at the top of the show, but the value of the Pixel Remaster is, again, I don't get any money from anyone in the industry. I'm not saying this because I'm sponsored by Square Enix. I think the value of the Pixel Remasters is very, very high at $75. I highly, highly recommend you buy it. You can also buy the games individually in a la carte, but I think that costs you an extra $20. So you might as well just get them all, and you should play them all. But if you want to know their full availability in the West anyway, the PS1 version bounces around. I don't know if there's a PS Classic. I don't remember if there's a PlayStation Classic for PS3 and Vita and PSP for that, but you can check into that. The Game Boy Advance version is probably fairly accessible. That came out in 2004. And that version, I never played that version. I believe that was the version that had a bunch of extra shit in it. I think it's called Dawn of Souls. I don't know. I don't remember. But then the PSP...
the Soul of Rebirth.
Is that what it was? Soul of Rebirth.
Soul of Rebirth. I haven't played it, but I read about it. It sounds very cool.
And then the PSP version is the last version of Final Fantasy II I played. And I actually, it came out right before I moved to California. And I had both 1 and 2 in my PSP. That was like all I had to do my first few weeks there. So that game, a very nostalgic memory of that game. And then there's iOS and Android versions of it that have been out for a long time, more than 10 years, if you want to play those. And then the Pixel Remaster versions came to PC and iOS and Android a couple of years ago. That's like the better version. I don't even know if the old ones are available anymore because of that, actually. And then like Dagan and I are playing it on Switch and PS4. So you have a lot of options. Were you going to say something, Nick?
So many options. No, that Soul of Rebirth I don't know, call it DLC, extra add-on or whatever. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's just an extra dungeon, a little extra sort of place to explore, maybe one extra town. But you know what it is? Just reading about it, it's the dead heroes, Minwoo, Scott, Joseph, and Ricard, I think, as sort of playing as ghosts, their own quest that then ties in, I read, to the ending of the actual game proper. It sounds really, really cool. And, you could see it as a retcon, but a way to flesh out some pretty cool characters, would-be cool characters that we just didn't get enough of. I would definitely like to go and at least watch a Let's Play of that.
Yeah, I think that might have been in the PSP version too. I just don't think I played it, because what I remember about the PSP version was there was like an extra dungeon or something. There was cool shit like that where you can get new equipment and all of that. Yeah. But I don't think I ever did that stuff. I'm not that in love with Final Fantasy II. I would imagine I'm never going to play Final Fantasy II ever again.
Yeah, that's the thing. You're putting this to bed. We know that.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But it was a fun conversation.
Yeah, that was really fun, man. It was. You know what? It's really nice to go back. I knew how much people like really angrily hated this game, and I could see some of the areas of frustration. But if you go back and just look at it in a historical context as a template, pretty cool.
Yeah, I agree.
Pretty neat.
I agree. There's a lot of the bubblings of something special here that I think I gave credit to other games for in a previous life. So, well, that was fun, Dave. Let's end this episode of KnockBack as we always do with a dad joke. I leave it to you.
All right. Now, Kyle, I don't know if it's looking a little yellow in my studio, and I forgot to talk to you about this. I don't know if this is making its way down to you, but the wildfires in Canada.
It's all fucked up here. Yeah.
Is it really?
Yeah.
The air quality is so bad that they're saying they kept the kids in from school today. And you could see it. You could see it over the past couple of weeks during sunset, but now the sky is just yellow. And it's last night smelled like somebody was burning their fireplace. This is far away. This isn't even in Ottawa. This is in central Canada, right?
Yeah, I think some of it is in I think there's some fires in Alberta, but I think there's a lot of stuff going on now in like Prince Edward Island or something up there.
Oh, wow.
Maybe not Prince Edward Island, like New Brunswick or something up there. Like
yes,
right above
that's
us.
what I thought it was. Yeah, because I have a couple of friends up there, but it's amazing how I've never seen anything like this. I know there's millions of acres on fire or something.
Yeah, it's I think totally out of control, and it sucks. The thing about global warming of wildfires that I find so funny is that it's always tied into the conversation about global warming or climate change. And I'm always puzzled which fires are supposed to have happened and which fires are not supposed to have happened. And so I look at a fire like this and I'm like, what if this, because fires are natural. You're supposed to have them the time immemorial.
Sure.
And that's just a natural part of life. But we know that some of them are also the predicate of some of them is the changing climate. And so I look at some of these fires and I'm like, how annoyed should I be about this fire? Yeah.
Would this have happened in the 70s?
Yeah, it's unclear because everything's blamed on it. I'm like, well, that can't be true. So which one is normal? Like the hurricanes, like which hurricane was supposed to happen?
Yeah.
And then which hurricane was global warming responsible for? I'll never know.
Oh, so it's made it down there to Virginia too.
Yeah, dude. Okay. I was looking at my phone. Let me see if I can pull this up. I was just on the weather module. It shows, let me see if I can get the map up here. Well, that's what it shows on my phone for like our area.
Oh yeah, so
it's red, which says, yeah, but why can't I open the? I thought there was a bigger map than that.
They don't want you to see.
Oh yeah, no, there we go. So you can see, I'm in. I don't know if it's coming through for people, but I'm in. That dot is the red.
Oh wow,
and that's where I am. And your area is even worse.
It's bad here.
Yeah.
I mean, it's visibly yellow outside.
Like that's kind of like your area.
Yeah.
Where the black
it's intense.
It's interesting. So I like going for walks. I've been going for walks a lot now. Micah and I have been just to try to shed some extra calories or whatever. And I don't know if I should go out there. Am I going to get the fucking black lung?
So Helene texted me. She's like, "Don't go for a walk today." But I don't know. I don't know. It looks.
Go for a walk, no balls.
Outside, I have to say.
I
wish I could turn the camera and show you guys. It's just like yellow outside. It's like really weird.
It's like you're on Titan.
We're really far away. And you're really far away from it. But all right, my friend.
Well, I hope everyone up there is safe, whether or not global warming is responsible. Who knows? But stay safe up there, my friends. And thank you for
about you guys.
I'm worried about you guys for a lot of different reasons, but that's definitely one of them. That was Final Fantasy 2. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time for more KnockBack. Until then, goodbye.
Wait, don't forget the dad joke. No. It was my fault. I went on and on.
Dad joke.
About my yellow Coldplay. Shades of Coldplay out there. Okay, Kyle. My wife said I should do lunges to stay in shape. That would be a big step forward.
All right. Thank you for interrupting my exit for that horrible dad joke. We appreciate that. Yeah, I forgot. That was my fault, actually. As usually is. All right, now we're satisfied. Let's go. Goodbye. We'll see you next time. KnockBack, a retro and nostalgia podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Collins Last Stand LLC, and is recorded from Central Virginia and the Philadelphia suburbs, USA. The show was conceived by and is produced by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-host is Dagan Moriarty. KnockBack's executive producer is Dustin Furman, and the show is edited by associate producer Ben Smith. All of Last Stand's theme music is by Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand Media's shows, including KnockBack, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer support level or higher on Patreon, and we're grateful for your kindness and generosity.